pretty close to 20 years now. Yeah, my background really is I was in the military as a bomb disposal technician for a few years, and then made my way into commercialization of renewable technology, and then through consulting into that path.
All right, so shall we begin by actually revealing the name of the book for the first time ever?
Yeah. I teach a course in strategy at the university, and they asked me, what do you want to call your course? And I said, I want to call it What to Do When You Don't Know What to Do. The feedback I had was no one would turn up to that. And I said, I think you're wrong. I think there's plenty of people who have or are in situations where they genuinely don't know what to do. And it's not because they lack options. Most of the time it's because they have too many options. They have too much information. They have too much analysis, and that creates a situation where people are feeling a bit lost. So we talk about adaptive strategy as an answer to that question: what do you do when you don't know what to do? Which is the title of the book.
Yeah, so do you want to kick off the presentation by sharing your screen?
Yeah, sure. I'll share my screen.
And by the way, for anyone unaware, this session is being recorded. So if you're speaking towards the end, or if you're sending in questions to Doug, you can do so via the chat. Don't mention any client names or anything like that, as a heads up. Anyway, sorry.
So just give me a thumbs up. Everyone can see that?
Yep.
Cool. All right. So we're going to talk about the past, present, and future. So really today it's talking about how did we get to where we are? How does it manifest in the present? What is today like from a strategy perspective or a philosophy of strategy perspective? And what are we going to do about it? But first we'll talk about why we wrote the book. So my journey to where we are now really started with my management degree, which was in the late 1990s. For those of you old enough to remember those days, and the world was very much dominated by the business process re-engineering ideas. And what I saw was the reality of the world didn't fit what the management theory was telling me. There was a gap. And I have spent, I guess, the next 20 years exploring that gap. Why does the world operate in a way that the management theory I learned at university teaches us? Why is there a gap there? So we really, adaptive strategy was born through that process. And as I moved through there, starting as a consultant, and I know JP's experience is very similar, as people are asking, in terms of adaptive strategy or in terms of these new approaches or this newer paradigm, is there anything I can read that kind of bring myself up to speed? And my answer there is, yeah, there's plenty you can read. A lot of it is written from a very theoretical basis, and there's not a lot of it is actually joined up. So the book that we're writing, What to Do When You Don't Know What to Do, is really about joining up those ideas in a way that's coherent and actually useful. So we're looking for a high utility book that you can read and then do something with the next day. Our mission is not to change the world by giving you new knowledge, it's to change the world by showing you how to do things differently. And this quote here from Diego Espinosa kind of sums it up, is our personal relationship with uncertainty is fundamental to being human, yet over the last 30 years, we've begun outsourcing it to the certainty merchants. So those who are selling false certainty in the face of real uncertainty. And that panders to the human desire to reduce uncertainty. And our philosophy around adaptive strategy is, how do you engage with uncertainty? How do you engage with complexity in order to create a strategic advantage? So how do you play with it in order to learn? And how do you then amplify that learning to create advantage? And those that can learn to do that will outperform those who are stuck in this need for false certainty. So I'll hand over to JP to answer that question. What is strategy?
Right. So this is one of my favorite questions. Anyone who's seen me speak will probably know that I've done this one a fair few times. what strategy is often sort of assumed, right? But typically what you end up with is strategy is one of four different things. So strategy can be a plan, which is a kind of a how of getting from here to there, right? It can be a pattern in actions taken over time. A strategy can also be a position. In other words, a decision to offer certain products to certain buyers in certain markets, or it can be a direction, which is kind of a vision or something to do with movement. But what is really interesting is that when you look at all of these four definitions that are the most common, right? What you realize is that they're kind of mutually exclusive. So a plan is indicative of something that's deliberate. You do something before the event, whereas a pattern and action taken over time is something that you can only really see after the fact. If you look at what a position is, well, that's kind of where you are relative to everyone else, right? Whereas a direction is indicative of where you want to be, and therefore, per definition, cannot be. So you get all of these various definitions. But having said all that, there's one definition to kind of rule them all, and that is that strategy is a plan, right? Most people think that strategy and planning is synonymous. And as it turns out, that's not actually the case, which Steve will now talk about.
Okay, so if you were learning strategy at a business school or a university any time in the last 30 years, you would learn basically this pattern. So we have change over time, and the first thing we do is say, where are we now? So this is our current state, and obviously most organizations have a lot of analytical capability, a lot of management information, financial reporting, customer segmentation, etc. So they find that relatively easy to answer. There are still a number of things that we don't know about our current state, and they might be things like, what our competitors are doing, what new technologies are coming down the line, the engagement level of our staff, etc. But generally, we're pretty safe in that position. The second thing we do is then pick a North Star or a big, hairy, audacious goal or a set of objectives. So where do we want to be? And then the role of the strategic planning or the facilitator for the strategic planning is then to close the gap between our desired future state and our current state. And the gap becomes the strategy. How do we get from where we are to where we want to be? For some reason that's still unknown to me, it generally takes the form of a 3 to 5 year time horizon, never 4. So if you write 4 down, then you're immediately disqualified from being any kind of expert in strategy. And then what we do is we can plot midpoints in that. So where do we need to be next year in respect to that journey? Where we're going to be in year 2. And really what we're doing there is we're creating a big baseline assumption that the future is either knowable or any change between now and the future is within our capability to detect and respond to. So we have a tendency to underestimate the amount of true difference or change that's coming or potential for change in the future. If the future is known, then we can plan like this, but by and large, that assumption of the assumed future or the assumed state of the system is generally false. And we get surprised by change, we get surprised by events that we didn't predict, we get surprised by things that weren't in our strategic plan. The mode of operation that it gives us is one of prediction, planning, and control. Prediction is generally the collation of data and the analysis that goes through that. It paints a picture of the future. The various futures techniques, scenario planning, etc., can allow us to get a bit more predictive. And then we plan is the strategic plan on how we're going to achieve our objectives in the future. And then control becomes the mode of operation in respect to management and leadership. How do we stick to the path? How do we make sure that we're on the right track? Here, in a traditional plan, implementation becomes a matter of resource allocation. If we're off track, we need to put more resources into it. If we know or we assume if we apply these resources over this period, then we will achieve these results. So we're in the domain here of where we know what the system is going to do, and we can put the resources in to achieve what we want to achieve. Management is concerned with keeping us on the right path. And you'll all know, and you'll all have been through a process where you do a review of the plan, and we're trying to work out how we stick to the right path. I'll just talk about how that's a bit different to an adaptive strategy. In an adaptive strategy, we can start with a 3-year horizon, although we don't need to. And we're certainly starting with the idea of resource allocation. So nothing changes there, really. I think for the most part, we put the 3 to 5 year horizon in to satisfy those who need it. We know that change is non-linear, and if we have a direction of travel, or we are thinking about a direction, then the timing for that doesn't actually matter as much. So the time aspect of an adaptive strategy is quite a lot more diminished than it is in traditional strategy. The second thing we do is, of course, where are we now? What capabilities do we have? What are we happy with? What are we unhappy with? Then we start to think about a shared understanding of success. So in what direction do we want to move based on our current conditions? So we're asking the question, how do we maximize our potential, rather than how do we achieve our goal, or how do we stick to the path? Once we've asked that question, then we don't need to know the future. We just need to know the present, and we need to know which direction we want to move. Now strategy becomes a set of parallel experiments. Some of them are large and some of them might be small. They're large when we have confidence in the ability to control the future or control our part of it. And they're small when we don't have confidence, or they're places where we want to explore, or we're launching into new territory. Some of those experiments will be successful, others will fail. The objective here is learning. We're learning from the things that are working and not working. We're putting resources into the areas where we're starting to see success, or starting to see the system improve. And we're shifting resources away from areas, or deliberately moving the business away from areas that are starting to look unsuccessful, or starting to look dangerous from a risk perspective. What we're concerned with in an adaptive strategy is the direction of travel and the tempo. Are we moving in the right direction at the right tempo? And we can always ask that question. It doesn't matter what's coming. We can have a COVID situation, we can have a GFC situation, we can have a large competitor enter the market, we can have a large competitor leave the market. And we can always ask the question, how do we maximize our potential? Where can we move to next and experiment and explore? What can we put resources into that's working? What can we shift away from? And you'll see the difference here is the path becomes, the path becomes an emergent property of the action. So adaptive strategy is about how we act over time, as opposed to where do we want to end up, which is the fundamental difference. In the book, we're going to explain in a lot of detail how we do that. So what are the methods and mechanisms by which we answer the question, how do we maximize our potential? Okay, the mode of operation there is more about exploring and learning. It's more about getting fast feedback from the system, as opposed to trying to analyze the system and work out how it works. And then it's all about rapid exploitation of success. So rapid resource reallocation when we're starting to see opportunities to shift away from or shift towards emerging success. An important thing to know about adaptive strategy is we still have objectives, but objectives will emerge as a consequence of action and interaction. And when they do, they'll be far more authentic than objectives that come from an analytical and predictive view. So when the system's changing quickly, we're wanting to look for these authentic objectives, as opposed to the kind of best guess that we might have on time zero about what it's looking like at year 3. So strategy becomes a continuous process. We're looking at direction and tempo. And if you have a group of people who are engaged in experimentation, learning, amplifying success, moving away from failure, then you can see by that dynamic nature of their work that they're more likely to be positively engaged. They're having more control over their domain. They're having more direct interaction with new ideas and with emergent opportunities. And that's where we start to see this idea of positive engagement and an innovation culture becoming direct consequences of how we work. So what we're doing is shifting away from this sort of pseudoscience of culture change, and saying culture emerges from a positive way of working. And adaptive strategy gives us the basis for Okay, so I'll throw it back to JP to talk about, how did we get here? What is the historical view of management thinking?
Right. So much as how Steve mentioned, the book is set up in three parts. Essentially, we have the past, present, and the future. The first one being how we got to where we are. The second, again, how it manifests in the present, and the last one, essentially, what we are going to do about it. And for the purpose of this presentation, given that we only have so much time, we are going to be talking very briefly about sort of what has happened throughout history. And then for the next webinar, whether we do two or three, we're going to be talking about the manifestations of the present, and then we'll have the big kind of, okay, so what do you do about it then later? But to Steve's point around strategy, and strategy being essentially the art of applying resources over time in order to achieve a target, that implies that there's a problem to be solved, right? Because if a problem was not in any way involved, you wouldn't need strategy. It would just be a process. And there's a point to that, but there's also a reason why we think. And in order to understand that, we need to go back through history. And we begin with, as you can now see on screen, the, I suppose, famous or infamous apple of one Mr. Isaac Newton. And yes, you can go back farther through history if you want to, but again, for the purposes of this presentation, let's keep it short and sweet. And so what happened when that famous apple fell was that it set in motion more than just the laws of physics. And in particular, it gave rise to this idea of determinism. In other words, the idea that what happens tomorrow will be impacted by what happens today, just as how what is currently happening has been impacted by that which happened yesterday. And I've written about this in the newsletter, so some of you will be familiar with it. But the most sort of famous form that it took, if you go back a stage, by the way, we're not getting that just yet, Steve. Thank you. Is that it was expressed in the form of what is called Laplace's demon, right? And Pierre-Simon Marquis de Laplace was essentially Francis Newton, right? And he took this idea of determinism to the extreme. And so he basically meant that if there's a smart enough intelligence, a high enough intelligence that has sufficient enough data and computational power, that being will be able to detail every historical linkage and thereby model our collective past and predict our individual futures. And this, of course, we see in our everyday present as well. I mean, this idea that when we're facing a problem, the solution is just more data, whether that's qual data or quant data or Gen AI or whatever, right? We just need more data and we'll solve the problem. Of course, as we also know, that's not necessarily true, but it comes out of this idea. And what then happened was that we're now dealing with the Enlightenment movement, right? And so these ideas spread far beyond the reaches of physics into, for example, economics. And this is where we start to get into the really weird findings of our research. And we've really dug deep into history. We haven't just read the books by the authors, but we've even read sort of personal correspondence of the authors and the thinkers and their co-workers and whatever else. And we begin with this guy. So this is Léon Varlas, right? So he was French, much like Laplace. In fact, he was born about 60 miles from where Laplace was born. However, his intellect did not share, shall we say, the same proximity. And so his academic youth was rather uneventful. He was twice rejected to a prestigious engineering school because he had poor mathematical skills. He eventually got accepted into a less prestigious school, again in engineering, but was kicked out because, again, he had very poor mathematical skills. He then had a go at banking, didn't work, poor mathematical skills. And then he attempted to write a bit, and that didn't really work out. So one day, one sort of fateful evening, he was kind of fed up with life, and he was talking to his dad, who, like his son, was a great admirer of science, like many men were at the time. And his dad pointed out that economics, which up until that point was essentially like philosophy, didn't really have any maths or anything like that. And so the younger Walras decided, like, okay, so here there is nothing. So, the barrier to entry, so to speak, is very low. I'm going to have a go. But again, he had very poor mathematical skills. So what he did was he took a bunch of equations from mechanics and statistics and basically went, yeah, these equations seem to make sense, even though I don't really understand them. They must also apply to firms and markets. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the foundation of modern economic theory. This is the man who Paul Samuelson, Nobel Prize winning Paul Samuelson, described as the greatest theorist of all time. Is a man who doesn't understand mathematics and thinks that everything applies, that physics apply to everything. And most of the modern ideas that we get today, things like utility theory, equilibrium theory, this assumption that people are rational, you can trace that all the way back to Walras's work. And what is really fascinating is when you look at it is subsequent work hasn't really been about challenging the original assumptions as much as trying to prove them under the assumption that the assumptions were true, if that makes sense. And the fact of that is that when you start unpacking these flaws, you immediately start spotting the flaws of modern theory. So take a very sort of recent example, relatively speaking anyway. We have this idea of general competitive equilibrium. This is the biggest idea currently, I would say, about how markets work, right? It comes from Arrow de Breu. I think they won 2 or 3 Nobel prizes for it. And fundamental to their work is, again, Laplace's demon and this idea of determinism. They think that you can pre-state all dated contingent goods. Now, what this means essentially is that, to use their example, 100 years in advance, you can predict what the price of a bushel of wheat sold in Oregon on a rainy Wednesday, the day after the Boston Red Sox have won the World Series, what that price will be, right? Again, this is literally their example. And they're making the assumption that, of us being able to pre-state this. Of course, if we go back 100 years, you realize that this is all a nonsense, right? No one living 100 years ago could have predicted what the price of a secondhand iPhone on eBay would have been during the pandemic, much they wouldn't have been able to predict the iPhone, probably the pandemic, and especially not eBay, right? So it is a kind of a nonsense, but you're starting to see sort of, again, how this ties back to this idea of determinism, Laplace's demon, and whatever else. Like you just see it flow through history. And today we make those kinds of assumptions, right? In economics, just as we do in strategy, of course, strategy being sort of half economics and half, I suppose, strategic management. But again, the idea is if we just collect enough data, we will be able to predict not just the behavior of our employees and our competitors and any invention that they come up with, but of people who, rational as they are, will do as we predict, given that we give them the right decision parameters. In other words, our consumers. And to say that this is a dangerous false assumption is to put it very mildly indeed. But again, this is all about economics. What about the sort of closer relative? We're going to strategic management. And again, things aren't exactly dramatically different, to be honest, because of course, the ideas of the Enlightenment, again, sort of seep through the rest of the world. And it was inevitable that eventually it would make it into strategic management. And among the first people who really implement these ideas was, of course, the one and only Mr. Frederick Winslow Taylor, the creator of Taylorism. And we won't go into his personal history here today, although we do in the book, but there are some things in his past, especially the past of his colleagues, that maybe tie Taylorism back to slavery. But anyway, what you need to know for the purposes of the present is that he created scientific management. And the idea was, again, that businesses worked like physics and organizations were like machines. So employees in this analogy are like cogs, and that means that you can optimize them. And so, for example, the stopwatch that we use today, where you sort of clock in and you clock out as you go to work, that's one of his inventions. This idea of efficiency, that is very much the popular talking point of today. That comes to Taylorism. But what few people know is actually how that came about. And so what Taylor did was that he took out his stopwatch and he looked at how much iron his workers could carry in 14 minutes. And because of this idea in physics of sort of material reductionism, which basically means that, what happens on the micro applies to the macro, you can aggregate and you can scale and you can reduce and whatever else, he extrapolated the 14 minutes to concern all of a working day, which is the equivalent of timing a 100-meter sprinter and then assuming that he can keep that pace up for an entire marathon, right? It goes without saying that this is nonsense, but this is the foundation of efficiency. Right? This is the idea. And what inevitably happened, of course, was that people weren't able to keep that up. And so the story goes, the sort of supporters of Taylor, they argue this anyway, that Taylor therefore created brakes. In fact, it wasn't he himself who did this. It was his colleagues. But also what is missed is that as brakes were defined anytime that you would walk back, sort of back from whatever you drop off the iron back to where you would pick more of it up, that was considered a break. And again, we extrapolate across the entire day. It looks like, well, this person got some time off, and that wasn't really the case. But what's also interesting about Taylor is that you're starting to see this displacement, which is going to become sort of a through line through history, which is a displacement of incentives. So Taylor created the profession of management consultant. He was literally the first management consultant in the world. And because of it, he had to sell his services. So there was an incentive displacement. He then essentially had to make things up in order to make a sale. And this became sort of a big thing. By the way, you can go back one slide, Steve. And so he was quite adamant to work with sort of PR. And so what happened, as a sort of very interesting tidbit of history, was that there was a man called Louis Brandeis, who was a lawyer, and he was arguing against proposed rate hikes by the Eastern Railroads in the US. And his argument before the Interstate Commerce Committee was that they were completely arbitrary in the way that they set the prices up. What they should have done, well, they should have used scientific management. And if they had, they would have saved $1 million a day. And this was astronomical at the time. What does that mean? Of course, it made a lot of headlines. And so Taylor became an instant legend, basically. He grew famous overnight. And this is where things get really interesting with Taylor. Because at Harvard, there was a guy called Edwin Gay who had been struggling to set up a business school because you couldn't really teach business, right? But then he visited with Taylor as a result of the headlines. And lo and behold, Taylor told him exactly what he wanted to hear, right? There was a science to business management. You can sell it as an academic practice as a result, and that became very easy, right? And that's also what happened. So this, the exaggerated claims of this lawyer led to eventually Harvard Business School being set up and Taylor being one of his key lecturers, right? And so with this, we get the era of business physics. So we get management thinking driven by efficiency, performance measurement, strategic planning, causal determinism, blah, 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 that remain today. But also, again, he was a consultant, so there was this incentive displacement. And this is where we get to Peter Drucker. And this is also where I would imagine that things start to get slightly provocative, maybe, because Drucker is often hailed as this guru, right? And he's very liked by everyone. If you go to a conference, you're going to hear a bunch of quotes by Drucker, I would imagine. He's considered one of the greatest management thinkers of all time. But what few people know is that he originally rose to fame as an outspoken critic of Taylor. He wrote a book called The Future of the Industrial Man, where basically it was written against the backdrop of an industrial world war, right? So it became an instant success. And he basically pointed out that this idea of a mechanistic organization and the employee as a cog, that basically it eliminated the humanity out of everyone, right? Just stripped it straight off. And it was a scathing critique, and you're going to find some quotes in the book. But the problem was that, much like with Taylor, his success kind of led him to become a management consultant. And again, you have that incentive displacement. And so what happened was Taylor's ideas were very popular with managers at the time, right? They didn't want to lose that power. And so Drucker realized this, and in one of the great 180s in history, suddenly decided, no, actually, Taylor was the Newton of the science of work, and he was a great humanist, and blah, 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 right? He just completely changed his tune. And the reason why he did that was, again, to sell his services. And similarly, his own work that he then launched, which was originally launched as, I suppose, being more humanist, actually he had to say that, well, actually, it's not that humanist. It's more to do with top-down management and the objectives that you talk about in MBOs, management by objectives, which were his thing. They're not really negotiated the way that he originally argued, because never were in practice. One side held the leverage, blah, 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 blah. So again, you're starting to see this sort of change in behavior depending on what the market is looking for. And the measurement systems used by Drucker and the measurement systems used to this day still rely on the same kind of Tayloristic quantifiable data, right? We track performance data. We add rewards and punishments. This also comes out of Drucker, by the way. And interestingly enough, something that few people know, psychiatrists and psychologists at the time basically said that MBOs were like bullying, which is sort of, again, puts Drucker in a whole new light. But again, so what we're seeing then, sort of summing it all up, is that we're seeing causal determinism taken from physics into economics and into strategic management. You're starting to see a displacement of incentives, which basically means that people are either skewing the evidence to the degree that it exists or making it up altogether. And we're starting to see that, and of course we see that in modern theory all the time, which leads us to Porter, which Steve will now be talking about.
Okay, Michael Porter is the author, I guess, that most of us would have read again in the 1990s and 2000s. And Porter's view of strategy was very deterministic. So you work out from a systems perspective. So this is this idea of systems thinking. If you're familiar with Porter's 5 forces, for instance, it's about where's your place in respect to the forces of your competitive environment, your ability to control your supply chain, your ability to effectively defend your position. So this is a very, very deterministic view. And what it does, and what it did at the time, was it reflects the sort of great corporations of the time. If you think about organizations like Ford and General Motors in the US, were defending their position through sheer might. They just had the scale and the power to create a fortress and then defend it. And what we see with a sort of a Porter's view of the world, there's many organizations who still follow that idea. Many organizations are still looking for what you might call a sustainable competitive advantage. That's where that type of language comes out. If you think about drivers and levers for change, are very much the language of this sort of mechanical determinism. If you can defend your position through IP, for instance, you've got a patent suite, then you can keep new products and competitors at bay. So that was really the Michael Porter view. And our introduction here is saying, actually, if you examine the way under conditions of uncertainty and complexity and rapid change, that it gets harder and harder to build that fortress. It gets harder and harder to follow a Porter's view of strategy. So adaptive strategy is about saying, actually, we're going to compete by moving faster and adapting quicker than our competitors. What that really means from JP's sort of explanation is coming from Newtonian physics through the application of that into mathematical models, from the application of that into some sort of unquestioned assumptions about how organizations work, and then through the consulting world of Drucker and Porter is this idea that we have been indoctrinated. We have been led to believe that the world is deterministic, and all we need is a better plan in order to accommodate or create that strategic advantage. We've been led to believe that more data and more analysis will give us more insight, and that insight can be used to create strategic advantage. And our view is that is fundamentally wrong. The reason we've written this book, the reason that we're really here today, is to say the world is an ecosystem. We're part of a continuously dynamic system of organizations that will live and die. We need to maximize our potential by virtue of exploration and amplification of success. We don't know what the future is like. It is indeterminate. We cannot know what the future is like, and we'll show you by using Stuart Kaufman's work in the book why that is fundamentally true. And then if it is true, then traditional strategy cannot, or the processes and methods and formulas used in traditional strategy cannot be used to tell you what to do. So it is almost certainly true that most organizations are sitting in a place where they literally do not know what to do. They're taking their best guess. And what we're saying is actually there is a path through that, and that's really where we're at right now. with adaptive strategy and with encouraging organisations to explore, experiment, learn, amplify success, and then create those opportunities through interaction rather than trying to find them through analysis.
Yeah, and I
JP,
think,
have you got?
yeah, I was just going to say, we can skip this slide. We can just get to the last bit.
Yeah, so that was fine.
But so the thing is as well, I think it's important to emphasize is that what we are saying is not unfounded. I would argue that it's probably a lot more scientific than the underlying work of people like, you know, Laplace, not Laplace, but Walras and Taylor and whoever else. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at sort of the evolution of physics, so if the physics basically went from Newtonian mechanics to quantum theory to now sort of Kaufman's third paradigm of science. We haven't seen that same evolution in economics, nor have we seen it in strategy or strategic management. We're still kind of stuck in the Newtonian ages, right, which is essentially pre-Enlightenment ages. And the fact of the matter is that there is a lot of hard science that we may use in strategy, such as, for example, complexity theory. But it is high time that we start doing that. We can't just rely on old, untested assumptions. It's, again, like trying to build a house upon a very uneven ground. And the manifestations of this on a daily basis, well, that's all the problem. Those are all the problems that we see. I mean, if you go into any situation, any kind of strategic decision that you need to make, what's the first thing that you observe? Shit, there are a lot of people who have an opinion on this, right? It's kind of like if atoms could think. Well, that's the reality that you're dealing with. And so again, as sort of Steve alluded to, the book really is about why is this, how does it manifest, and most importantly, and this is the major part of the book, what do we do then, right? When we're faced with a situation where we don't know what to do, when we don't know how people will act, what do we do then? And the idea is, again, to sort of tell you that and do it in such a way that you can just implement it on Monday, even within the sort of the current structure of the organization. Steve?
I haven't got anything more to add to that. I'm pretty sure we've made points pretty clear. We've got a reasonable amount of time remaining, and really for me, I would like to take any questions. Either write them in the chat, or if you'd like to come off mute and just ask them directly, that would be great. I've always said, you know, agreeing with me is not a prerequisite for success. So we really are at the sort of forefront of new thinking here, and we reserve the right to be wrong. So if there's anything you've heard that you disagree with, or anything you'd like to ask us, then please feel free.
All right, we'll open up the floor, so to speak.
Who's the brave people in the room?
No questions? That would be impressive given how I sped through history like, you know, nobody's business.
Sure, I'll ask a question. Maybe if you could just share an example or a story of companies or organizations that are actually embodying it or doing it right.
Shall I start?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. And it's a good question. I kind of thank you for asking it, because it lets us showcase some of our work. So the first answer to that is my journey to where we are now involves a large earthquake in New Zealand's second largest city, which is Christchurch. It basically flattened the place in 2010. And I saw that the rebuild activity there was in quite a geographically bounded area, so the city itself, and it was unprecedented. So no one had faced that type of situation before, certainly no one in New Zealand. And it occurred to me that traditional strategic planning, with its predictive nature, was not going to accommodate the type of changes that were coming. So we advised a major construction company to take a more adaptive approach. And the adaptive strategy process that we outlined in the book is effectively the nucleus of that was the rebuild of the Christchurch earthquake. So the companies that we worked with just became more adaptive, more agile in the true sense of the word, and more responsive to the changing needs. They didn't formulate a long-term plan with a very rigorous resource allocation. We talked about, what are the weak signals that we're going to need to put resources into this place? How do we follow the things that are emerging in that market? And they were quite successful through that. And we've carried that through our consultancy. So AGLX is founded on basically that approach. And we now work with many companies around the world where we, particularly in the electricity industry, for instance, where they're facing major changes with distributed generation and climate change, etc. How do they become more adaptive and responsive in the face of that when you're dealing with engineers who are good at putting wires on poles? And that's, got a really strong path dependency in that space. So we're unlocking that with adaptive strategy.
By the way, there's a point to be made as well about how adaptive strategy is not entirely reactive. You can be proactive in that, which ties to your example of the Christchurch situation. Do you want to just mention the head fake regarding certain contracts that you used?
Sorry, I didn't catch that, mate.
No, the where you sort of were able to convince the opposition that you were moving in a certain direction when in fact you were not.
Yeah, one of the key, construction is particularly competitive, and we think about how do we act in a way where people think we're going all in on one project in order so that they will copy that, knowing that we're more adaptive. So their path dependency then locks them into a path that they end up winning it, but they're winning a long-term contract with a shitty client that's going to make no money. And we pull back, and then now we can take projects around that where we can negotiate a better fee, have better clients, etc. So the adaptive capacity that you build with adaptive strategy can be forward-looking. It's not totally reactive. Is that where we go?
Yes, sir. Yeah, that was my point. Because
cool.
No, because one of the things that people often forget when it comes to strategic planning, especially in this age of sort of Gen AI and whatever else, is that strategic plans can often become predictable, because if you're dealing with the same kind of data you get from the same kind of sources, and you have the same kind of people using the same kind of frameworks, and they come from the same kind of background, the same kind of school, and read the same kind of books and so on, you can largely predict what they're going to do. But that's something that not a lot of companies have figured out yet. Whereas adaptive strategy is a lot more difficult to predict. Now, we had a question from the chat. Jose, and apologies for the pronunciation of your name, writes, during your literature review for the book, was there any specific work that particularly influenced or impacted you? And if so, why? And I'll start. So the book is, the literature list of references is rather extensive, to put it mildly. And we've tried to read as broadly as possible. Having said that, to take one example, within complexity, I think it's difficult to ignore the work of Stuart Kauffman. He is, for those of you who are unfamiliar with him, he is one of those people who've sort of been close to winning a Nobel Prize. I think he's aiming for that with his latest work on the third paradigm. But he's a theoretical mathematician, biologist, physicist. He's physician and a bunch of other things. He's written about a gazillion books and papers and whatever else. He's basically a genius. I think he's pushing 80 something at the moment. And his work on complexity theory as a founding member of sort of the Santa Fe Institute has been very important. And Kauffman, speaking of why, and Kauffman's work is not only is sort of very high quality, but he has a knack of explaining things in such a way that people get it. I mean, yes, you need to focus a bit, but you kind of get it. And I'll use one example from the book, which is one of his original examples, to kind of illustrate the point, right? So we were talking about causal determinism and the prediction of the future and Laplace's demon and whatever else, and general competitive equilibrium, by the way. And this small example will disprove that. So imagine now that you have a screwdriver. right? In front of me, you have a screwdriver. The question becomes, what can you do with a screwdriver, right? Well, you can use it to screw in a screw, obviously. You can prop open a door. You can prop shut a door. You can scratch your back. You can, stab someone. You can put it on a stick and sort of spear fish, and you can then rent that spear out and create a business. You can use it as a talking point in the presentation online. The point is, the number of uses of a screwdriver is context specific, because the number of things you can do with a screwdriver depends on the context in which you use it. Secondly, the number of use of a screwdriver is indefinite. It's not infinite. You can't do anything with a screwdriver, but we won't know what the next use of a screwdriver is until we think of it. And thirdly, as a result, the only scale that you can put the number of uses of a screwdriver on is nominal scale. In other words, just different uses, kind of like Bob, Giuseppe, Roger, whatever. They're just different uses. It's not like this use is 0.2% different to that one, or hotter or colder or whatever. They're just different uses. And these things combined mean that the number of uses of a screwdriver is non-algorithmic, right? It doesn't matter how much data you have, it doesn't matter how much computational power you have, you literally cannot calculate the number of uses of a screwdriver nor the next use of a screwdriver. So this is one of those examples where you go into complexity theory, you can disprove the traditional paradigm. Now, having said that, Steve, anything that you have?
In terms of authors, I'd acknowledge the work of Dave Snowden, who's been a colleague of mine for the last 15 years, certainly drawn very heavily on his work in complexity, so anthropology and complexity seen by humans. Just in the interest of time, we've got a question: how do you decide what the right size of experiment is? Tempo may change over time as conditions change. How do you know the right tempo? So I'll just quickly address that. The right size for me is when we're faced with uncertainty, our first objective really is to learn about the system. How can we create value in this new system or this changing system? So the right size of an experiment in that space is, well, firstly, it has to be something that can be safe to fail. So if you have to go all in on a big bet and you're wrong, you don't exist anymore. And there's plenty of companies and plenty of examples of people who have done that. And the second point I'll make is, what is the minimum amount of energy? So that's, time, resources can be your personal brand or political capital. Can I expend? So what's the minimum amount of energy can I expend in order to learn from this system or test this thing? That's the right size. And then what that does is it allows you to reduce the energy coefficient needed to explore, which increases the amount of exploration you can do, and reduces the risk of any one of those things sinking the whole ship. In terms of tempo, my view there is, if the system is changing quickly, take smaller steps more often, so increase your tempo. If the system is changing slowly and you have more or greater ability to forecast or foresee change, then you can slow your tempo down and really lean into the things that are creating value. So your tempo has to match the tempo of the system. If you're too fast and the system's slow, you become bleeding edge. If you're too slow and the system is fast, you're falling behind, you're suffering strategic drift.
Yeah, I just want to sort of add to that with a practical example of the size of the experiment. So over the last 5 years or so, I've done a lot of work in e-commerce, and in e-commerce and digital sort of commerce and direct consumer commerce, what happens is that you invert the traditional model. The traditional retail model is a many-to-one model. So your consumers, your buyers will incur the cost of transportation by coming to you, and this has a bunch of benefits. If you sell things online, it's the opposite, right? So it's a one-to-many model. You need to send all the shipments to all your individual customer, and that creates a cost structure that actually, as online penetration grows, what tends to happen is that your profitability declines. So you need to make up for it in some way, right? So you need to mitigate. And so there's a company in the UK called the Hut Group, and they realized that this was a problem, and they launched 26 various kinds of mitigation at the same time. And our point is that when you run these kinds of experiments, they should be safe to fail. In other words, if things do go sour, then you will be able to afford that. And you need to think about that, speaking of the size of the experiment, you need to think about that as a whole. So if you're launching 50 experiments, or in this case, I think it was 26 or 28, at the same time, collectively, they need to be safe to fail, the experiments that you're running. In the hot group's case, that's clearly not the case. And we can currently see that with their stock price and their performance figures and whatever else, right? That just appear to be costing them too much. Now, we had a couple of people raise hands. So Doug, if you want to sort that out.
Yeah, shall we, Patrick, I think you raised your hand first. So if you can come off mute and give the question.
Yeah. Thanks first of all for the webinar, for the free webinar. I see a huge gap between what we currently do in practice in a huge corporation and the thinking and the theories that you lay out. Steve, you said culture emerges from the way of working. To me, culture is also depicting how we work today. So where do we start with those, as you call it also in other presentations, safe to fail parallel experiments?
I would be very tempted to throw that question to my colleague Doug, if you're comfortable answering it, mate.
The one on culture, sure. The guest speaker on your book launch, sure. So we see culture as kind of interactions, the emergence of interactions over time. So when we're talking with people that we're working with respect to culture, we're saying how do we shape those interactions in the best way possible. So we think about in terms of understanding the system, if we think about the constraints that are present in the system and how they are impacting the different interactions between people that we're seeing, then we say, okay, well, how would we change those conditions to get more of the kind of interactions that we want and less of the ones that we don't want? And so culture is it's not something that is static. It's something that continues to evolve over time. And so something we're continually monitoring and thinking in terms of management, we're thinking about how do we help the conditions shift. Does that help with that question?
Yeah, so maybe the second part is how do you start with it? So for example, if you do not use the safe to fail parallel experiments, how do you start with it?
I think one of the sort of tenets of data strategy is start from where you are. And if all you can do is work within your domain of control and ask the question, what are the interactions that I see that are giving rise to things that are positive in terms of how we describe the culture? And then how do we get more interactions like that? Then each team, group, or business unit can do that. They can actually do that independently, because culture doesn't have to be consistent. In fact, it's almost impossible for it to be consistent across an organization, especially a large one and one that's geographically split. But you say, what are the things? I ask people, often get people to actually have discussions or write down, tell me about a time when you've been really proud to be part of this team. Tell me about a time when you haven't been proud to be part of this team. And then we can say to people, how do you act in a way where you get more stories like this? And how do you act in a way where you get less stories like that? And that idea comes from Dave Snowden's work in naturalized sense making. But you can do it within your domain of control and start from where you are. One of the tenets of complexity, again, is this idea of it's very difficult to change the system at the systems level. We have to change the system in a small way and then allow that to amplify across the organization or the ecosystem in a more natural sense. It's very hard to have big sort of top-down change, particularly around culture, that will almost certainly fail.
Thanks.
We've got 2 minutes, 1 minute left. Samuel,
So
you've had your hand up for a long time. Yeah, can you give us a question and then we'll wrap it up after that?
Yes, something. Thank you for the webinar. And so to be directly to the point, what do you see like so the essence, or one of the part of the essence here is to explore and discover the next option, like the next adjacent possible. I know you've written and talked about. But how do you decide what to even explore, right? Because we can go in any direction. So we have to limit and choose what do we explore. And I find that some of these more proactive methods, like scenario planning you mentioned, for example, can be like helpful to discover, is this an interesting direction? Should we make experiments toward this or toward this? And I would just like to hear, like, how do you even decide on where to go when there are so many options?
Right. So if you look at the ABCD framework, which obviously we have on the book, right? So the B will stand for boundary. So you can consider it, instead of the one line in the sand drawn by strategic planning, where you get all your employees to stand on line and then hopefully they won't just take a step to the side. You essentially have two lines in the sand, right? And you go, okay, so currently these are the outer limits of what we allow. And then within that, you allow people to experiment. And so, because at the end of the day, you're dealing with, for example, finite resources, right? So you can't do anything. And to your point as well, if people are allowed to try anything, the problem is that they spend a lot of time running really, really fast without actually getting anywhere. So we need to enforce some sort of constraint so that they move in the right direction at the right tempo. And in the ABCDE framework, that is done through boundaries. Steve, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think how we approach that with our clients is we say we want to establish a clear sense of direction. So your experiments need to be coherent with that direction. Coherence in this sense means there's a logical flow to that activity. Whether or not it works, that doesn't matter at this point. We're here to learn, but it has to be coherent. And the second one is oftentimes, particularly in this day and age when organizations are facing like an existential crisis, then the management team has a right, or should at least, I think, have an obligation to set like the main effort. This is the thing we really need to solve. Right? There's a whole lot of other interesting things we might do, but right here and now, this is the thing we need to solve. So the best example, the clearest example of that, a couple of years ago, I was working with a former HR manager at Tesla, and she said to me, you know, our direction of travel was really, really clear. We had to make a viable prototype by March, whatever year it was. Otherwise, none of us had a job. So if you're going to experiment and explore, then it better be in the service of that objective. You see where I'm going? So the role of the leader in that sense is to tighten or loosen the constraints in order to have the evolutionary potential shift in a certain direction. If you're too narrow, to JP's point, relax your constraints, force people to go outside of their comfort zone. And then we have to do this in things like the electricity industry, where a lot of electrical engineers just want to put wires on poles, or the water industry, where a lot of people just want to build bigger pipes. Or if it's too broad and you say, look, we really need to solve for this, and I see you guys out there exploring about the coffee cups in the tea room, I'm going to bring the constraints in. So managing the constraints becomes the key to your expression of leadership in that sense. But thanks for that question. It's a good question.
Right,
Okay,
we've come up on time, so JP, I'll hand it to you for closing thoughts.
I'll let Steve have a couple of last words as well. But again, thanks you all for coming. We are currently finishing the book. As soon as we have a publishing date, we'll let you all know. The next webinar will be on the manifestations, and if we have time, hopefully we'll talk about how we actually can solve these problems in the present, and for the future, kind of what we just sort of touched upon just during this Q&A. When that is, we don't really know. It'll probably be in a couple of weeks' time to a month's time. Depends on a bunch of things, not least my bloody builders, which is why I have this image of Hogwarts behind me. But Steve, any closing remarks?
No, I just want to thank you all for spending the hour with us, and I appreciate those questions. And I look forward to catching up with you guys in a couple of weeks.
All right, lovely stuff. Thank you all, and hope we'll see you soon again.
Thank you all. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye-bye.